Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Fostering Healthy Relationships and Preventing Sexual Violence webinar. My name is Véronique Church-Duplessis, and I'm the Bilingual Program Manager at White Ribbon. Before we begin, I would like to mention that the content today can be triggering for some, and I encourage anyone who is triggered by the content to reach out to professionals for help. I've included a number of resources available to residents of Canada that could provide some well needed support if the content proves to be difficult for you today. Just a few words about White Ribbon before we begin. White Ribbon is an organization that mostly works with men and boys to prevent gender-based violence and promote equity and transform social norms, particularly gender norms. We're committed to supporting men and boys to realize their potential to become part of the solution to end gender-based violence and promote gender equality in our society. So the goals of the webinar today are to understand the importance of consent education and bystander education, particularly in the secondary sector. We will also look at how the Draw the Line campaign can help educators teach youth about consent and sexual violence prevention. And we will look at what you as educators can do to end gender-based violence and promote gender-based violence prevention in your school communities. So when we talk about gender-based violence, we're talking about an umbrella term that is used to emphasize that this form of violence occurs as a result of unequal power relationships in our society and as a result of gender norms. It is gendered violence because the vast majority of the victims of this form of violence are women and girls and LGBTQ plus folks, and the vast majority of perpetrators of this form of violence are male-identified folks. Gender-based violence includes several forms of violence, including physical and sexual violence, but also economic, verbal, and psychological and reproductive violence as well. Gender-based violence is not often talked about, but it is quite prevalent in our society. Half of all Canadian women have experienced one incident of physical or sexual assault since the age of 15. 1 in 3 Canadian women will experience sexual assault in their lifetime. And there are some groups in our society that face much higher than average risks of experiencing violence, including Indigenous women, women with disabilities or cognitive impairments, trans women, LGBTQ folks, and young women. So this is an issue that is present in our schools and that affects young people around us. And we do a disservice to them if we do not talk about the issue and give them tools to prevent and respond to sexual violence, intimate partner violence, and dating violence, and other forms of gender-based violence. So there are multiple root causes of this form of violence. Today we will be mostly paying attention to gender inequality, social learning, and harmful aspects of masculinity. But it is worth mentioning that particularly when we talk about violence against Indigenous women and girls in Canada, colonialism plays a significant role. It is the main root cause of violence against Indigenous women and girls. So gender inequality and patriarchy have been present in our societies for a very long time. And because of the unequal distribution of power between the genders, it can lead to violence. And we will be looking at harmful aspects of masculinity as well as some of the root causes of this form of violence. Now, before we continue to look at those harmful aspects of masculinity and gender inequality in our society, it is worth mentioning that another harmful aspect of the rigid gender norms that we still see in our society is that gender identities and gender expression do not fit neatly in a binary. And in fact, in our society, as well as in other societies across the world, there are many different ways of identifying when it comes to gender identities. And if we stick too closely to rigid gender norms, we are erasing and not making space for folks who identify otherwise. So oftentimes when White Ribbon does workshops in schools, we talk about the man box and the expectations that are placed on young men and adult men in our society to act in a certain way so as to help them be seen as real men. And this man box is connected to violence and violence between men as well. So the 7 pillars of the man box are self-sufficiency, acting tough, physical attractiveness, rigid masculine gender roles, heterosexuality and homophobia, hypersexuality, and aggression and control. And there is a strong correlation between adhering to those pillars and using violence in our personal relationships. Oftentimes when we do this work, we have participants look at gender norms and expectations, and we ask them to think about what it means to be a real man, in quotation marks, in our society. So what are the stereotypes and expectations? And then we look at the correlation between those expectations and the use of violence. So oftentimes our participants come up with a box that looks quite a lot like this, and these stereotypes are alive and well in our society, and we need to work hard to create space for young boys to be different and move away from that box and allow them to still belong and have a sense of belonging and acceptance from their peers. Now, when we do this activity, we also look at the insults that are used to police men and boys when they don't conform to this prevailing masculine archetype. And what we see is that most of these insults are either sexist or homophobic in nature, and they do create a hierarchy between those who are in the box, who are considered the real men in quotation marks, and individuals who are by nature inferior, so women and girls, and gay men. And this power dynamic, this inequality between people is already reinforced by the use of those insults to police the masculinity of men and boys who don't fit in the box, who deviate from the box too much. Now, what we see is that there's a connection between trying to conform to those stereotypes, trying to fit to those expectations too much, and violence, particularly when we look at traits that can lead to violence, including being dominant and aggressive, but also being in control and powerful, as well as the more limited emotional literacy that and acceptable emotional range that we allow men to have in our society, including the fact that anger is often seen as the one manly emotion that is acceptable. And there's a clear connection between those expectations and violence. A 13-year-old boy in Alberta confided that those expectations, the expectations that are attached to what it means to be a man in our society, can have negative outcomes. So this young man mentions there's so much stuff like guys shouldn't cry, they need to have big muscles, guys can show feelings, they can't show pain, you know. So if you can't do all that, it's just going to build up inside you, and you gotta let it out sometimes. Either that can be a good conversation, or it can be a bad release where you start a fight with somebody. And the work that we have to do is to help young men develop spaces and means and the ability to be vulnerable so that they can have those good conversations when they're struggling, when they're experiencing difficulties in their lives, and so that they can have those good conversations and get help as opposed to starting a fight with others. Now, those traits in the man box are not necessarily inherently bad. In fact, some of them are good qualities, but um, those traits become harmful when they're based on the assumption that women and LGBTQ folks are inferior and that men should be dominant and in control. Um, Masculinity also becomes harmful when it promotes aggressive and violent behaviors to assert power and dominance. And it's also harmful when it limits men's emotional range, making anger one of the few acceptable emotions for men. Now, a 2017 study from Promundo showed that there was a clear correlation or connection between the box and violence, and that the young men who tried to conform to the men box are much more likely to perpetrate bullying than the peers who don't feel the same pressure, those who fall outside of that box. And young men who conform to the box are far more likely to have perpetrated sexual harassment against women and girls. And when looking at countries such as the UK, the US, and Mexico, young men in those countries were 3 to 6 times more likely to have perpetrated sexual harassment if they subscribed to those traditional masculine expectations and tried to conform to that box. So part of the work that we have to do is to promote healthier ways of being a man and helping men develop their emotional intelligence. So I invite you to listen to our other webinar on healthy masculinities to get more information on this topic. Another thing that we need to do in our schools and with our students is talk about the dynamics of healthy and unhealthy relationships, because those harmful gender norms often make it difficult for young men to establish and maintain healthy, meaningful relationships with others. So if a young man is trying to conform to the ideals of dominance, control, and limited emotionality, he will have a hard time developing healthy relationships with himself, with his friends and family, and eventually with his intimate partners. And one way we can do this is by helping our students identify what dynamics are healthy or unhealthy in a relationship, and help them build empathy for folks who may be in an unhealthy relationship, and ask them how they would intervene or what they could do if they noticed that some of their friends were in an unhealthy relationship, be they romantic or friendship relationships. And so we can run our students through some common scenarios that highlight some problematic dynamics, particularly when it comes to control or to trust issues or to jealousy, and help them see that trust is an essential component of any healthy relationship, and control is not acceptable. And one of the ways to do this is also to break down what the basic parts of healthy relationships are with our students, and talk about what that looks like and what it means, including nonviolence and non-threatening behavior, and not just in terms of physical violence, but also in terms of coercion and manipulation and guilt tripping and so on. That their healthy relationships are based on equality and trust and support, honesty and accountability, negotiation and fairness, as well as on sexual safety, so that the people involved in a relationship have the ability to make decisions about their own sexual life, and that their boundaries and safety are respected. That healthy relationships are based on financial and economic independence, and that they're not transactional. So they're not based on the idea that buying something for someone means that they owe you something, and that we can use money and gifts to get leverage over others. And finally, the idea that connection with others are essential to any healthy relationship, because it is not true that our romantic relationship will fulfill all of our human needs, and that it is essential to maintain good connections with our families and with friends, even if we have a very meaningful connection with our romantic partners. And education on what healthy relationships look like is necessary, because popular culture and the media often gives us false ideas about what good relationships are. So we often see some problematic themes in very popular movies, particularly when it comes to not respecting women's boundaries and not taking no for an answer. And that teaches young men that they should pursue women and girls until they give in. And that when a woman says no, she doesn't necessarily mean it. For example, in the movie The Notebook, the protagonist, Noah, threatens to jump off a Ferris wheel and kill himself if the woman he pursues and who has turned him down before doesn't agree to go out with him. And that is coercion and not romantic, but it is portrayed as romantic in that movie. And related to this idea of healthy relationships, we really need to spend some time talking about consent, and consent not just in the context of sexual relationships, but in all aspects of our human connections and interactions with our students. It's all the more important given that Canadians overall do not have a very good understanding of consent. So what we want to do with our students is help normalize a culture where asking for permission, asking for consent, both within and outside of intimate relationships, is the norm. We want to encourage them to call in on their friends when they notice that they're not respecting other people's boundaries. We want to encourage them to talk to their friends and their siblings and other people in their lives about consent and what it means, and how to help them get a good understanding of what the process looks like. And we sometimes like to use the Planned Parenthood I Love Fries infographic to help our students remember what the different aspects of consent are, to help them understand that consent is not simply a no or a yes, and highlight that consent is never automatic and that it has to be obtained every time, even in the context of relationship, that it is reversible, and that it must be freely given, that a person hasn't been coerced either physically or psychologically, so that they haven't been manipulated or pressured or guilted into giving consent. And that is very important, since half of all Canadian women report that they have been pressured to engage in sexual activity against their will. So this coercion and the psychological manipulation is all too common. Consent is also has to be informed. The people involved have to know what they are consenting to. It has to be an enthusiastic yes, and it has to be sober. So intoxicated people are not able to make informed decision and understand all the repercussions and the consequences of their decisions, and that means that they cannot consent to sexual activity. Again, as with the relationship question, we often find it useful to go through consent scenarios with the students to understand and analyze whether there is consent in a given situation or not. And in addition to asking whether a person is consenting, we like to help build empathy for students and ask questions such as, how do you think the person in this situation feels? What do you think of their relationships? If you were friends with these people, what would you say to them? How would you intervene? How could you make a difference? To help these conversations, as part of the Draw the Line campaign, we have developed some scenarios that look at consent and bystander intervention and help students think about common scenarios that they might eventually find themselves in and look at what they could do to make a difference and intervene in those scenarios. Those scenarios are part of the Draw the Line bystander education campaign. So the goal of the campaign is to make sure that a bystander, that is someone who witnesses an event that may be problematic and therefore in a position to intervene and make a difference, is able to identify the event as problematic and knows what they can do to help and intervene. So when we're talking about bystander education, we want to make sure that bystanders understand the 5 steps of bystander intervention, which is first noticing that an event is happening and interpreting that event as being problematic. And then we want to make sure that bystanders understand that they do have a personal responsibility to help, that it is not a private matter, and that if they witness an incident of violence, it is on them. They have a responsibility to step up and make a difference. Then we want to make sure that bystanders are aware of actions and steps that they can take to intervene safely and effectively and to put those into action. We want to emphasize also that bystander intervention can happen before an incident happens, when the incident is happening, or even after an incident has happened. And it is important to practice those skills because most people are not prepared to intervene when they encounter a stressful situation. And by practicing those skills, it becomes easier for them to know what they can do when they encounter a problematic situation. We also encourage folks to think about a couple of things when it comes to bystander intervention. First, we want to think about why it's important to intervene, when it would be appropriate to intervene, and how they can likely intervene. So there are 4 different intervention styles, including direct intervention, where a person intervenes directly in an incident, delegation, where a person either gets help from others or delegates to a person with more power or authority in a situation so that they can intervene. Distraction, which means that you are either distracting the perpetrator or the potential victim to make sure that they are safe and an incident stops, and checking in, which includes listening to a survivor and helping them get the help that they need. When we're looking at intervention styles and actions that folks can take, it's important to take into considerations risks and safety. The goal of bystander intervention is never to put a person at risk. And a bystander should always think about their own personal safety and make sure that they wouldn't be putting themselves in harm's way when they're intervening. However, we do want to emphasize that not intervening is not a neutral option. By doing nothing, we're allowing for the violence to continue or to happen, and we're becoming complicit and part of the problem. Whereas by intervening, we're becoming part of the solution. So it is important to think about that impact, particularly in situations where a potential perpetrator might be one of your friends or someone in a position of authority over you, and a person with whom you have important connections. but letting them get away with it is not a smart decision, because doing nothing does allow for the violence to happen and to continue. Now, when we're thinking about our ability to intervene in a threatening situation, we also have to keep in mind how a bystander's position of privilege or marginality will impact and limit their ability to intervene in the way that is safe and effective. So folks who mostly fall on the privilege quadrants of this wheel, the social location wheel, have usually a greater ability to intervene without putting themselves at risk, whereas folks who experience multiple forms of marginality and oppression have a more limited ability to intervene in a way that will be safe for them. So they usually put themselves at more risk when they intervene in those situations. So for folks with more power and privilege, there's kind of an added duty to step up when you encounter situations of violence. Now, one of the reasons we do bystander education is that it's a very beneficial type of education, because it really shows that sexual violence is everyone's issue and it's not a personal or private issue. Bystander education also helps normalize conversations about sexual violence and help folks think about situations where there is no consent. Bystander education also helps youth gradually develop and practice the skills they need to intervene instead of looking away. And when done correctly, when good training is provided, bystander education is connected to reduced incidents of sexual violence as well as other forms of interpersonal violence. Now, to help you do this work in your schools and with your students, we've developed teacher's guides that contain lesson plans that you can implement in your classrooms and help your students practice the skills they need to be active bystanders. The guide uses a proactive approach and is based on real-life scenarios that help you normalize conversations about sexual violence and its prevention. The lesson plans are bystander focused, so that means that the focus is not on a potential victim or perpetrator, but rather on the power that every student has to make a difference as a bystander. So it engages all students and it helps you challenge assumptions and myths about sexual violence. The guide is a one-stop resource on bystander education and sexual violence prevention. It is quite comprehensive and includes an introduction to the topic of sexual violence, information about the campaign, suggestions and tips on how to introduce this topic in your classroom, some lesson plans, as well as some curriculum connection charts that draw on expectations in the Ontario curriculum, and additional resources to support you and your students. This guide is available for free online at dtl.whiteribbon.ca/foreducators, so you can download your copy and start using it in your classroom. Finally, as educators, we are role models, and it is quite important for us to think about the example we're setting in terms of promoting healthy relationships and gender equality and the practice and implementation of consent. So for those of you who identify as male, for those male identifying educators, we have an e-learning module that will help you build your capacity to work with the young men in your classrooms to promote gender equality and violence prevention. So if you go to itstartswithyou.ca, that's the name of the program, It Starts With You, itstartswithyou.ca, you can complete this module, which also includes activities to help you bring this topic in your classroom. There's also a student module that looks at the benefits of gender equality, looks at consent, and looks at some myths and facts about sexual violence. So I wish to thank you for your time today as we're reaching the end of this webinar. I encourage you to reach out if you have any questions or comments. Furthermore, our resources and other webinars are available on our YouTube channel. And I invite you particularly to have a look at our Healthy Masculinities webinar, which complements this one nicely. And you can find all of the resources from the Draw the Line campaign that will help you bring these activities and these topics in your classroom at dtl.whiteribbon.ca. Thank you for your time today, and